Oh, we're back doing jazz hands today, roaring 20s. I've been doing jazz hands the whole time, so it's not the same episode. It's continuous for me. I love the flapper movement. So this is part two of our Prohibition episode, and just a quick summary. We covered about 80 years, with a topical approach leading up to Prohibition. So, as mentioned in the last episode, the Volstead Act, as it's known, went into effect at midnight, January 16th, 1920. And now alcohol was essentially illegal in the United States. And a lot of things happened during this period. It would last for almost 13 years. It's crazy to think. But now we're at the beginning of a new decade where the American economy is booming and cities are going up. Automobiles are on the streets. Meep, meep. Say, mister, get out of the way. Meep, meep. So you see those old cars, but there's also horses and carriages on the street. So it's got to be a really cool time. And the people out west, like, what is this? A car? And the trains and technology is moving and industry's flourishing. And we talked a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt helping to push back on the power of the handful of rich people controlling the whole country and putting some labor things in place, but then some things got knocked out of place since then. But here we are at the beginning of the Roaring 20s. So they passed the act. Now it's got to be enforced. And the states were like, hey, we don't have the manpower or the budget to enforce this. And a lot of states, like I'm in Connecticut, Connecticut's like, we're not going to be a dry state. Just keep it low, keep it on the down low, but we're not going to force it. So the government assigns the responsibility of enforcing the law to the Treasury Department. Like, why would the Treasury Department be in charge of like police officers essentially to enforce prohibition? And that's because they had a small system in place because prior to prohibition, there were a lot of moonshiners and illegal distilleries that were making liquor because there was a tax on it. So some people just wanted to drink without paying the tax. So these moonshiners in the South and the illegal distilleries were already selling and smuggling a little bit of booze. So the Treasury's job was to go track them down and capture them so they could get the tax revenue that was missed. So the government says, okay, you guys can run this, a bigger version of that program. The problem is Congress only allocated like $690,000 annually to the budget to enforce the law, which is really nothing. Even in 1920, the Fish, Game, and Wildlife Department was getting like almost 3 times more of that. So they're only able to hire 1,500 enforcement officers. So now these enforcement officers spread out across the country. So America's in prohibition. All the bars are closed, the saloons are closed. You can't sell it. You can't buy it. You can technically drink it if you have it, right? We mentioned that if you go to church, you can get some of the Holy Sacrament. That was okay. So there was some wine there. And a lot of these churches actually went from ordering X amount to X amount. So there was like an abundance of wine pre-ordered by the church, and they increased their orders because there was some production to be able to supply some of the industries that needed, like the Holy Sacrament. And then we also mentioned the pharmacies. They were able to get whiskey. And I can't remember if we mentioned this or not, but prior to Prohibition, the Walgreens family had like a handful of pharmacies they launched, right? And because you could get a prescription of whiskey, one every 10 days from your doctor, so families, like a family of 8, everybody was getting sick. So now they could get 8 prescriptions every 10 days of whiskey. Still not enough for a raging alcoholic, but better than nothing. So the Walgreens family went from a handful of pharmacies to over 500 by the end of Prohibition. So people were trying to find ways to get booze. And then there was a company that basically made grape juice. and they would sell these blocks. And on the side of the block, a grape, it was like a bar of soap. It would say, warning, if you leave this for like 30 days, it will turn into wine and could be dangerous. So they started selling tons of these things. Alcohol wasn't illegal in other places. And what happened was a supply system started to emerge, and it would be illegal. So in the beginning of Prohibition, some of the newspapers polled Americans, like, do you want this? Like 40% of them were like, no, we don't. We want to be able to drink. And that was at the beginning of Prohibition. Towards the end of it, the same poll went back to these Americans, the same pollsters, and it was 80% of people were like, we want to drink. So even though it went into place because of the pressure from these lobby groups and resources and these temperance movements, because politicians were scared to lose power, this law goes in place. But people wanted to drink, even the people in Congress. So here's how we started getting booze, right? We'll talk about a couple scenarios, and you can multiply them by hundreds, right? So there was a gentleman named Bill McCoy who's like coined the catchphrase, the real McCoy. So he would go to the Bahamas, load up with like whiskey and rum. He'd take a vessel all the way up 3 miles out from New York City. The 3-mile mark was the international water zone. So liquor wasn't illegal there. It was totally legal. So it would be coordinated that these little boats now would fly out to Bill McCoy, pick up what they wanted, right? Bring it back to the shore. And those were known as rum runners, right? These little boats. And when they got back to the shore, it would get dispersed out through shipping networks, through vehicles and trucks to the rest of the country. In a very short time, there were hundreds of Bill McCoys off the coast in the international waters, and rum runners were just flying like 24/7 out, shuttling booze back. And these enforcement officers couldn't keep up with this. So what evolved was the government had a Coast Guard that was just put in place like 5 years prior. They're like, we need more people and a bigger budget for the Coast Guard because booze is just coming in. We just can't. It's like, here it is. It's all flowing in the country. So the Coast Guard started putting pressure on these rum runners, and the area where all the boats were was called Rum Row. And so these guys out in the ocean started retrofitting their vessels, and they would put airplane engines in these boats. So they would move so fast at a ridiculous speed. And the same technology was being utilized by the rum runners that were running from like the Jersey Shore in New York City and Connecticut and Long Island out to these boats. And they started retrofitting theirs. So now they could outrun the Coast Guard. And there was shootouts and battles and people getting away with it and people getting arrested. And finally, the U.S. government said, hey, we're going to move the international waterway to 12 miles out. So now that was a lot harder for these little boats to go 12 miles out in the ocean. That's a long way in the Atlantic Ocean with storms and currents and the dangers of it. And then with the enhancement of the Coast Guard and their own technology, it slowly pushed that away. So the rum row got shut down, and now they had to move around and be more secretive. So they also were smuggling booze in from Canada through the Great Lakes in a similar fashion. And U.S. and Canada share one of the biggest borders in the world. So they were finding porous areas of the borders and just driving it in or carrying it in. And so a market popped up also in Seattle where it was coming down like from the Vancouver area. So now the booze is getting to the American shores. So now there's vehicles, right? So the vehicles would load up the booze and they would go. And it was really organized. And it was organized because one group or a group of groups that flourished during Prohibition was the mob, organized crime. They had some systems in place up until Prohibition. You know, they were mostly in gambling and, you know, collecting debts and money, but they didn't flourish like they will in Prohibition. So there's so many different mob syndicates in America, and we're going to focus on the Chicago gang, right? Which it was operated by a guy I think named John Torrio for a few years. He died, and then the famous Al Capone took over. This guy was just this flamboyant character in his like early to mid 20s, and he was running the Chicago mob. And so there started to become mob wars, right? Where you picture like the Tommy gun, where they're shooting each other down, and it got very violent and very dangerous. But they were able to coordinate the alcohol coming in and getting dispersed. So now where would it go? There would be individual buyers, right? And then there would be like saloons and then underground bars that would turn into something we call speakeasies. And these speakeasies would change American culture forever. But it wasn't just the Chicago mob. There was mobs, obviously, in New York City, every major city. Atlantic City was a huge one. If you ever watched the show Boardwalk Empire, Nookie Thompson, it's loosely based on Nookie Johnson, the actual guy that ran Atlantic City back then. But it's a great show. It's fictionalized, but it's really shows you the kind of stuff that was happening in Prohibition, and it makes it sexy. I'm sure it was a lot scarier and darker than they depict it. So these gangs were fighting each other and robbing each other, and finally they all get together to form a syndicate, almost like the rich guys we talked about in episode 1 that were controlling the prices of products and food and railroad tickets, those trusts. Well, the mob would do it, and they created the syndicate so they wouldn't battle each other, and then they could control the price of the illegal booze so that you couldn't be undercutted and everybody could control their market. And if people went against it, they'd work together to shoot them, kill them, and put them away forever. So we had this huge element of organized crime that literally was making like, I think, $60 to $80 million a year on illegal booze. That's a lot of drinking. And that's 1920. That money today would be, I don't know, times 4. So $250 million, $300 million when you consider inflation. So that's an incredible amount of money. So Al Capone was the big man. He was always talking to reporters, and he wore nice suits, and he was funny and smoking cigars. And he was kind of like this infamous character, somewhat of an American hero, right? Because everybody thought he was bringing the booze in. And the government just couldn't tie him to anything yet. So just a side note, let's talk about what happens to Al Capone. So eventually the government is like, we've got to stop this guy, but they couldn't tie him to anything. So in the South, there was a case where someone wasn't paying taxes on all the illegal booze money they were making. So the Supreme Court and the courts set a precedent that even though you are earning illegal money, you're still required to pay taxes on it. And Al Capone had a shitload of money, never reported income to the IRS, obviously never paid taxes. So they nabbed his brother. They saw some of the large payments his brother were getting. They were able to tie to Capone. They finally arrest him, and they bring him in for basically tax evasion, right? And in tax evasion, you don't get life in prison. Everybody knew he was killing people, or at least ordered people to kill people. In fact, in like 1929, I think there's a famous killing, the Valentine's Day Massacre. There's pictures of it on the internet. It was the cover of the newspaper. It shows dead bodies all over, just chopped down with Tommy guns. And people are now like turning. We don't want this violence in our community. So eventually they convict him, tax evasion. He gets 11 years, which is the max sentence for all the charges he had that were related to the tax issues. It was kind of like O.J. Simpson. If you remember in the 90s, and maybe you don't, but O.J. Simpson probably killed his wife and her boyfriend. It was almost obvious to people not even involved in the case, but he got away with it because he was acquitted. It would be years later, he got into a fight in a hotel room over somebody selling his autograph, and he got arrested for it. So when he went to court for that, the judge, in his mind, everyone knew that OJ was guilty. They gave him the max penalty for that, which was only like 7 years, but this is what happened to Al Capone. You knew he did something else. You got him for this, so you gave him the max years available by law of a conviction. So he ends up in Alcatraz, which is like this famous old prison off the coast of San Francisco. It's an island. It's supposed to be impenetrable. You couldn't escape from it. And when he was there, he got really sick. So later on in the 1940s, he finally gets out because of like some health issues. He was deteriorating. So Al Capone eventually dies, and he dies from syphilis, from the prostitutes he was having sex with. Well, he was a rich mobster. So he doesn't have an exciting legacy of he got shot down in the blaze of glory or got away with it. He dies of a brain-eating deterioration from syphilis. But the mob flourished in this, and it would be a thing into the future that really just built up the mob and leveraged them going forward in many different ways. The rum runners started getting shut down. The speakeasies were now open. And here's where it changes culture. So saloons, we talked about, were a place where men went to drink alone. But in the speakeasies, you'd like go down the stairs into a dark thing. You'd open a thing. What's the password? And you'd be like, chopping broccoli. And they'd be like, okay. And they let you in. You walk in. And then there was this band playing like swinging jazz music. And everybody's laughing and dancing and dressed up. And they were standing and partying. And this didn't happen in saloons. And the other thing was women started going to this. And they were going to this dressed differently than they'd have ever dressed before. So this new generation of women was like showing skin. They had a common short hairstyle. It was like the flapper movement. They were dancing and drinking and smoking, and they could be dancing with different guys and socializing, which was a no-no for women in society, according to the generation prior that were leading the temperance movement. So this was something new. And women also just gained the right to vote in the same year. So now things were happening. And some of this respect and independence was built for women because right before this, World War I was happening. And when all the men from America went to Europe to fight the war, like a lot of men, like our factories turned into a place to manufacture ammunitions. And there wasn't enough workers. So the women stepped into those roles and started doing the men's work. And when they started doing that, and nationalism kicked in because we were supporting the war effort, they gained a larger voice and power. They wanted to be paid the same. They wanted the same rights. And now the first step of women's independence somewhat started right before this. Then they got the right to vote. Then the speakeasies opened. And now these women of different generations were freewheeling and having fun. And they were dancing to the music of Black people in America. And it was just freeing. And everyone was partying. In New York City, at the height of Prohibition, there was 32,000 speakeasies in New York City. It's crazy. They're not all the big giant ones like you see in the movies, but they were there. You could go and drink, you could dance, you could have a good time, you could get liquor there. So this independence of women is a big deal. So now they can vote, they could work, they could have say in government, community, and from a family standpoint. And then they could like go on dates with guys. Like it wasn't like you're going to marry your fourth cousin. It's already been arranged and you'll meet him at church on Sunday. No, hey, I'm going out with Tommy on Thursday and maybe Joey on Wednesday and we're going to have a good time. So American culture was changing. It was music and partying and socializing. And now you're not talking about boring, stiff stuff. There's art and culture and people getting creative. And that's why it's the roaring 20s. And outside of these speakeasies, the economy is booming because of the technology and the needs. And now we're in a post-war setup where we're just resupplying America with all their new needs for their life and their house and their lifestyle. And it becomes a very exciting time. Women, ultimately, as we get into the 50s and 60s later on, they would the majority would regress back to Susie the housewife. But at this point in America, they were independent, bustling. There was freedoms and there was excitement. And now more men were coming to the speakeasies, certainly soldiers coming back from World War I, because there's women there. It's not like the old sausage fest they had in the late 19th century into the early 1900s. No more sausage party. Now we have women and men, and we're having a great time, and booze is flowing. We drank more during Prohibition than prior or after. So it was a pretty crazy time. One thing that also was happening during Prohibition was everybody thought they could produce alcohol, right? So when some of these guys that had a distillery or were moonshiners, when they were putting the mash in to create the liquor, there's like a real important techniques you have to use. It's not like fruit you just let sit there and ferment. So the first level of vapors can often be deadly and poisonous. And people didn't care or they didn't know. So like 10 to 20,000 people died from drinking poisonous alcohol, and probably a lot more because a lot of it probably wasn't reported. We don't know if people are doing it on purpose or it's just, hey, we just want to make money, send it out, or they just didn't know, or maybe they were doing it at home and they killed themselves and not knowing. So there was a lot of medical issues that also happened in there, a lot of hospital visits, just because of the type of liquor that was getting out there. And also, even the rum runners, you could get pure, good alcohol coming from Europe into the Bahamas. Now you get it to the mob, and the mob was storing it in warehouses, but then they would employ people be like, wait a second, we're going to make this last. Because of the demand, and liquor is now a commodity, the price goes up, right? It's got to be bought by the rum runner. He's got to mark it up, sell it to the mob or people buying it, and it's illegal. So there's like a risk factor there. So the price goes up. Then they got to resell it. So the price goes up. And what they did is they started like separating they get one bottle of booze and turn it into like 3 or 4 bottles because they would mix it with different things and things that will just make you sick to your stomach. But Americans drank it. And a lot of the booze tasted like shit because of that. So you could be in a speakeasy, and it was also an innovative time for drinks, like because you had to mask the nasty taste of the cut booze that they were selling. So that's where like the whiskey sour launched, and the gin Ricky, it was the common drink. And so all these cool bartending tricks and drinks were created to help mask the taste of the nasty alcohol, and we still drink them today. And it started in the speakeasies of Prohibition. Corruption was abundant because the mob was making so much money in so many different markets that everybody was on the take, right? So these enforcement officers that were trying to track people down to arrest them for buying or transporting booze, a lot of them were getting paid off. A lot of the police were getting paid off. A lot of the politicians were getting paid off. So the corruption was out in the open, and not a lot of people were going to prison for life for this, but people were getting shot and dying, and the laws being broken, and people were going to prison, but it just wasn't what you think. There wasn't enough people to enforce it, and they said like 1 in 10 of those guys was absolutely on the take, meaning they were turning the other way and letting the crimes happen to make some money. So this created a huge issue in the family, right? So kids are saying, Dad, like, you're making liquor, or kids, Dad, that man just came in and sold you and Mom liquor. Isn't that against the law? Yes. Well, we don't have to obey that law, but we have to obey these laws. We don't have to obey that law, right? That's a good question. So now the next generation, and this is like a real societal issue, was seeing like, you don't have to obey the law. Millions of Americans were ultimately knowingly breaking the law. So now it's like, if this law can be broken, then other laws can be broken. So a society can't operate like that. Yeah, it sucks having laws and rules and regulations, but it keeps everything in a system that's organized to create like structure, right? When we start saying you can do this, you can do that, obviously corruption in politics, they can always do this or that. It creates chaos, problem, and then it's not sustainable over time. So I'm going to tell a story of a man in Washington, D.C. that is like it's the apex of corruption at the time. He's known as the man in the green hat. And his last name is Cassidy. So he was selling booze to a congressman. And the congressman was like, listen, all my mates, they need booze too. He's like, they do? I thought you guys like outlawed this. You guys all voted to not drink. I'm like, yeah, but we need booze. So they set him up with an office on the congressional side of the Capitol, right? There's the Capitol building, and then there's the Congress side. I forget what it's called. It has a name. And then there's the Senate side. So they set him up with an office. And the weird thing about walking into the Capitol building back then is they never searched your bags on the way in. They only searched you on the way out. So you weren't like stealing document or government secrets. So he would just walk up with his suit and his hat, his green hat, and a suitcase. And he'd see the security guard, and he'd walk in every day. and he just blend right in because he did it during like the afternoon when people were coming and going. He'd go set up in like this makeshift office. I think it was made out of a closet or something. And people would just knock on the door and he would sell booze all day. Eventually, one of the security guards caught on. And so he was arrested. He had to go to court. He got 90 days in prison. He came out and he's like, this is what it did. This is my lifestyle, the way I made money. So he went back. But this time, he didn't go on the Congress side. He did the same thing on the Senate side. So he was able to get an office on the Senate side. The man in the green hat and a suitcase would walk right in, sell his booze all day to senators, and congressmen would come over, and even people from the White House. We know that the presidents were drinking, okay? We know that at this time, we're coming up to like, Hoover was the president. We know that some of his administration was drinking, right? It's just documented. They know. They talked about it later. So all these people that put the law in place because they feared getting voted out of office, that's why they did it. They're still drinking. So the man in the green hat is supplying about 80% of the people in the Capitol building. And what he did, because he had to keep a log of it, because he was a business. So he'd write down the person's name, what they ordered, how much they did. And so he had a book. So finally, after like 5 years, I think this is like 1930-ish, he gets arrested again. And this time they find his book of clients. So that's like a big deal here. So this book of clients never gets revealed. This man does not do any prison time. He's done, but he will never go back to the Capitol and sell booze again. We don't know whatever happened to that book. But what he does is he gets hired by the newspaper in Washington, and he writes a series of articles, hey, showing the hypocrisy of government, but he never gives up the names. And that's kind of cool. Like he could have just said, here's the list of people. Like that's what would happen today, right? Like the Elon Musk will just release it on X, you're off there. So, which is cool. Like whether you should always expose, I think, corruption in politics, because it's crazy that still exists today. And it's a thing. So he writes these articles describing all the stuff. I read these articles. It's crazy what he did, and to the people he did it to. But now the American people are like, what the fudge, man? Like, you guys are so full of shit. How come you guys can all drink and then set laws and create a budget for enforcement agencies to come arrest us? That's the pinnacle of corruption. So the American people, politics were windbags and corrupt, but now it was at the forefront that our system is so corrupt. And the man in the green hat, it's just an incredible story that just highlights government corruption. Plenty of government corruption. It's not like we need that story to do it, but this was very significant at the time. Underneath it all, our economy is raging and booming, and now there's a middle class emerging. The wealthy are getting hugely rich. Monopolies are forming again, even though like 20 years prior, Teddy Roosevelt tried to break up these trusts. Well, now these holding companies were forming, and these guys were getting wealthy, and the middle class emerged. And of course, there's still the lower class, because we need the worker bee, a lot of the immigrants and the children of free slaves, and then people moving out of farms that weren't successful anymore, coming into the cities. So we have like a 3-tier society now. So the people in the middle class, and of course the wealthier people, they're now investing their money, right? Because we're all tied to the system we talked about in the first episode, that everybody relies on a paycheck now, and it goes into the bank. So what happens to Joe's company could affect me, because my bank could have given him a loan for it. So now interest rates changed. So now we're all tied together in this capitalism system. And as it starts booming, people start buying stocks. And then in the financial industry in New York City, it's booming. People start like selling bullshit stocks, and then banks start making bad investments and speculative investments, and start doing the kind of stuff they did in 2008 when the banks were giving everybody loans for houses. Everybody. You didn't even have to show income. We don't care. We're going to give you a mortgage, because they never really had to give out all the money or back all the money. And what happened in 2008? Well, it was time to pay the pauper, and there wasn't money there to collect. And some investments were insuring those loans. And as our market went down, those loans came due. Nobody could pay it. It was a disaster. We had a small crash, a pretty big crash. But in the late 20s, it would be way worse, right? Because we had no protections in place. There was no protections. And you're going to see in a second, it's crazy what happens here. So people are making all these investments, their money's in the bank, they're saving. And then all of a sudden in 1929, like a decade into Prohibition in America, and the roaring 20s are raging, the stock market crashes. You're like, oh, big deal. Who cares? I don't invest in the stock market. Oh, no. The stock market crashes overnight in America. 5,000 banks out of money, gone, because they took the money that people put in the bank and they invested in stuff that was bullshit, right? Risky stuff. Now there's no money. Industries failed. I wanted to go to the bank to get my money. Like, sorry, dude, we don't actually have your money. In fact, we're closed forever. Boom, door shut. So families lost everything. Businesses lost everything. There were no more paychecks because there was no money to write a paycheck. People became homeless overnight. People lost their homes. The banks took them back, right? People were getting angry. They were living in the streets. Charities had to pop up to feed people. Americans were starving. And a lot of the rich, wealthy people, well, they were still rich and wealthy. It might have hurt them a little bit, but it's certainly, they have generational wealth. It didn't impact them like it did for the majority of Americans. And quickly, there was no more jobs, and all of the booming, roaring 20s and growth of technology and industry just came to an end very quickly. And the amount of homelessness and joblessness is like something we've never seen, and hopefully we never see again. Right away, like one in four people lost their jobs, right? And then within like a year, more people lost their jobs. There was millions of desperate people. They were building little housing huts in like Central Park, New York City, and in towns all over, because people had nowhere to live. They couldn't pay their mortgage. The bank took their house back if a bank was open. And some banks just closed. People just squatted in the house, and more people lived in it. And Hoover was the president. And so they started naming these little shanty towns of homeless people Hooverville, because like he failed the American people. His policies were horrendous. He let all this speculation and crazy stuff happen that 20 years prior, Teddy Roosevelt tried to put protections in place against that. They either repealed or didn't push through. And there was no FDIC protection like we have today. Today, I could put up to $250,000 in the bank. I don't have $250,000 put in the bank. But if I did, and the bank goes under or it gets robbed, I am protected. The government backs that money. I can get up to $250,000 back. So they didn't have that. Nobody was getting anything back. And it was a disaster for America. And so now, if we relate it to Prohibition, because that's what we're talking about here, a lot of people started talking about, we need to bring back at least beer or something. Let's give people jobs. And this wasn't like the first thing. This is just related to our conversation, that those discussions happened, that bringing back the sale of alcohol and the hospitality and the bars and would bring back industry and give people jobs and then generate more tax revenue as those things are sold for the government, because the government was screwed. So now we get into like 1930s, and along comes a man to save the day. It's another Roosevelt. It's FDR, man. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Like, one of the first things I did when I was in my early 20s, I read something called The New Deal, right? It's the most liberal book you can ever read. Just holding it, like, people, you're bad. But I thought it was crazy. Like, reading it, it's like, oh my God, I had no idea this stuff happened. Like, the things that went into place. And as I was researching some stuff and bringing back, like, oh, now I could associate it to that book a little better today. So FDR comes in to run for president in the election of 1932. And one of the things, his wife's out there saying, hey, we're going to repeal Prohibition. He didn't want to say that because he didn't want to lose voters, but he gets elected. He becomes the president in 1932. They're going to repeal Prohibition. We're going to create an industry to give some jobs there and to create some tax revenue from the United States. But FDR, as he's known, comes into the presidency with the weight of the world on his back, right? Tensions are mounting in Europe because like German socialism is starting, and there's a lot of global pressure. The United States is poor. Like, there's no jobs. The system failed. The drinking was out of control. and nobody's getting arrested for it, and it's not being regulated like we thought. So this experiment of prohibition, pushed on by the Women's Christian Temperance Union ultimately, and then supported by all these other movements, really just scared politicians so they could keep their jobs. So they ruined the lives of a lot of people. That didn't cause the Great Depression whatsoever. So FDR is like, America could use a drink. And so what they do is they repeal the 18th Amendment, right? But they repeal prohibition. You can't actually, they didn't repeal the amendment. We don't do that in America. What we do is, and let's just take a side note here. The 18th Amendment said you can't drink, American. Like, our Constitution is all about freedoms, right? Our freedoms and protections. That amendment said we're going to control the way you behave. And it failed. Of course it failed. You can't control the way we behave. Just the right to speak our mind or to bear arms or any other great constitutional amendment, but like, don't tell us how to behave. So they were going to take the amendment out because once it's an amendment, we leave it. That's the Constitution of the United States. They add the 21st Amendment, which basically says, forget about the 18th Amendment. Y'all can drink. But some changes in the way we drink would happen. So FDR comes into place. They voted out. Prohibition period ends. And it ends in a time where America's in the Great Depression, one of the darkest times to be alive in America. When you look back and research and read about it and you just look at like documentaries and video footage, it's a horrendous time. The plight of the people in America back then was just awful and nihilistic, right? There was no hope. And they blame a lot on the government. The government failed us. So FDR had to come out like, I got to save the day. So he came out with the New Deal, right? And what he did was, obviously, he put the liquor industry back in place, and he started setting up all these protections that a lot of them we still have today, including Social Security and payroll protection and bank protection. And then he was the first president. He's the first president like really talking to a microphone. Like most guys would like stand up and like, hey, Alvin, who are you doing, Smith? Think you're going to vote for me? And they would yell at the American people. But he had a microphone and like radio and technology was there. So he would just sit there. He had this fireside chat. You should listen to this. It's actually really cool, but you got to bring yourself back. So people are bringing radios into these homeless areas so they can listen. And like, they say like over 60 million people listen to the president. And he basically had a conversation with the American people like, I know we're fucked. Like, this is a bad thing, but let me teach you about banking. And he had to educate the people in a simple way, in a believable way from a politician, that we've got to have these banks because our system is now capitalism, whether we like it or not. So we want to fail and be communist? Okay. So it's important. The government's going to invest in this country. We're going to do a lot of stuff because we believe in you. Please believe in us and the banks. And when you pulled money out of the banks because you were scared of the crash and the depression, please go back and deposit that money back in the bank. Save America. And like for the first time, like, and maybe the last time, like everybody bought into it. Even people that didn't vote for him were like, yeah. And the next day, people went in and put money back in the banks, and it sort of propped up the system. And then the government invested money in and created protections, but that didn't help the jobs. And so now to rebuild America, to give us a higher ground so we weren't homeless and jobless and sitting around drinking and doing drugs all day, he creates like the national park system, and he sends like 3 or 4 million people across the country to help build and maintain parks. The government created jobs. He expands his roads, bridges, and tunnels and helps create jobs. And he does a lot of things through the New Deal to help prop America back up. And it's working a little bit, you know. You can't just dig out of there overnight. A lot of his stuff was aspirational, and then it quickly started getting pushed back by the other side. This is not a show about the foundation of capitalism and economics, but it's really interesting stuff. So we come out of Prohibition with the Great Depression, and we come out of that with the New Deal, and we launch into the 1930s of America. And some things we'll have forever. And here's a couple things that we learned and still have from Prohibition. this is a fun one, I think. When the rum runners were loading up vehicles on the shores after they got it out from Bill McCoy and the rum row, these cars back then, like they couldn't really carry the weight of all that alcohol. And then if a cop saw them, they certainly couldn't outrun the cop. So they started retrofitting these cars. They started tweaking the engine, making them more powerful, and then lowering the suspension and making it stronger. And by doing this, they kind of developed the next stage of fast automobiles. And when some of these smugglers weren't doing runs in Florida, they would get together with their souped up retrofitted cars and race each other. And then they started like decorating their cars and organizing it, and it became NASCAR. So thank you to Prohibition. This weekend we just had the Daytona 500 here. I'm not a huge NASCAR fan, but I appreciate the evolution of the technology and the creativeness of creating something fun out of something awful. And so Prohibition led to NASCAR. And of course, we talked about before, it led to a new movement of an independent woman that could vote, choose her life, her job, her place in society, where she wanted to go and what she wanted to do, at least for now. That would get batted back down later. We got liquor laws. So now in some states, you couldn't buy liquor on Sundays. Bars had to close at a certain time in some states. So these laws were pushed back to the states, like liquor's free or legal on a national level, but you can control it. If you don't want it legal, Alabama or whatever, Maine, whoever you are, then fine. But you can have it. So the states got to make their own liquor laws. So you can go into Connecticut. Like when we were younger, we'd have to drive from Connecticut on a Sunday to New York to buy booze because you couldn't buy Connecticut or booze in Connecticut on a Sunday. So all these laws came in place to kind of like manage the way we drank a little bit. So you couldn't go at 5 a.m. before work to a bar and drink. So they all had operating hours. Groups, like if you remember, we mentioned the Washingtonians back in like 1846. It was like a group for men who wanted to get drinking to get together and talk and support each other. Well, not too long after this, in the 30s and 40s, AA and groups like that, self-help groups start. And there's a new push for the way we treat addiction, right? So that kind of started after the Civil War because of the opiate addiction. But now, after this, and trying to regulate our society better so everybody doesn't become a drunkard or an inebriant, there was more rehabs and more continuity, how they all work together with the same sort of techniques. And then AA became very popular for everybody around the country. The corruption, it still exists today. All you got to do is go on your Facebook feed or whatever. And it's like, oh, a politician does this, says this, does that. It's like cognitive dissonance, right? I say one thing, I do another. That's politics. It was there and evident when the man in the green hat showed it to us. And it's obviously still exists today. So I hope you learned a little bit about Prohibition. It's a lot of stuff. I know I ramble and get excited. I'm all over the place. Some things, because I freestyle this, I might have messed up a fact here or there. But overall, you couldn't drink, people drank, and that was Prohibition era in the United States. Thanks for listening. Always email me comments, questions at historyondrugspodcast@gmail.com.